Hello everybody, thanks for downloading the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast, recorded in lockdown conditions due to the ongoing situation, so do bear with us with any sound issues you may experience. For the benefit of those listeners joining us for the first time, Fantasy Animation is a podcast and website dedicated to the discussion of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Each week we publish articles from academics, animators, fans and critics considering the latest in the worlds of animation and fantasy, and we are constantly on the lookout for new voices to join in the conversation and write pieces for us on subjects near and dear to their own hearts. You can find more information on how to contribute, as well as access our archive of editorials, reviews, creative reflections and sequence analyses at fantasy-animation.org. But for now, do enjoy the show.
The future. The polar ice caps have melted, covering the Earth with water. Those who survive have adapted to a new world.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I think this week I remain Alex.
And I'm 100% certain that I am still Chris.
Well, that's good to hear. This week, we're taking a little pause from our feel-good fantasy animations. We're going to dive into a cult classic, let's call it that. Waterworld, a film with a slightly infamous past and an infamous sort of reputation, but one that I had a lot of fun watching. I don't know about you, Chris.
Yeah, it was a film that I'd not, for my sins, not seen before. And it's one that's sort of, I suppose, not been erased from film history, quite the opposite, in fact. But it certainly has a reputation, as you say. And so I sort of, in many ways, was excited to sort of see and hear what all the fuss was about. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yes, but it won't just be the two of us. We have our very special guest, and I'm very excited to talk to him about it. Simon Brew on the podcast this week. Simon is a sort of serial journalist, magazine editor, and perhaps most famous for running the Film Stories podcast and magazine, and a self-confessed Kevin Costner fan, I believe, Simon.
Yes. And I mean, how long do you want on Kevin Costner? We've got weeks, yeah. I can do that.
If you do 45 minutes, we can shut up and go home.
I can do it in song. I can do a medley of his greatest hits, just in some kind of rhythmic, kind of The Greatest Showman style. Would that work?
Oh, it sounds perfect. Favourite Costner? Why don't we start with that?
My favourite is Field of Dreams, but then, like most films that are favourites, they tend to be the ones that mean something particularly special to you, and that one meant something particularly special to me. So I'm not really snobbish about best films and favourite films and things like that. I think your favourite is your favourite, and that one just always got me for an abundance of reasons I've bored people to death with in the past.
Cool. Tim Cup has a similar relationship.
Oh, it's just great, isn't it? It's just great. The best rom-com of the 90s, I'd say Tin Cup is. So smartly written. Rene Russo in that film as well. She never really gets the credit for the extraordinary collection of roles she put together in the 90s, and they were oftentimes just what could have been dismissed as supporting roles, but she always gave them something. You look at Ransom, you look at In the Line of Fire, you look at Outbreak, and you look at Tin Cup. I'm a huge Rene Russo fan as well.
Terrific. Well, okay, so we've delved into Tim Cutt there, but we're here to talk about Waterworld.
Yeah.
Simon, you're the film stories expert on the podcast for this week. So could you give the readers, or the listeners, I should say, a potted sort of synopsis, if you can, on what the story or the conventional story behind this movie is that makes it kind of an interesting one to chat about?
Well, the film itself actually has a fairly straightforward narrative tale to it. It's the polar ice caps have melted, the world has been flooded, the search is now on for dry land, and I mean, it's entirely fairly described as a Mad Max ripoff on water. I think that is the best way to contain it. I think one of the screenwriters on it admitted it's a Mad Max ripoff, effectively, on water, that you have this unnamed central character who is credited as the mariner, and it's the ongoing search for dry land in a world that's full of water. You can write that down on the back of a beer mat, really. And that's the guiding idea behind it. But what turned it into Hollywood infamy, really, was, being blunt, was the money. that this was in 1995 when it came out, it was by distance the most expensive film that had ever been made. And I think the record holder at that point was actually True Lies, which had taken over from Terminator 2 Judgment Day. But Waterworld's production budget came in the end at $175 million, which now is just chump change for a blockbuster movie, really. But at that point, to spend that amount of money on a single movie was regarded as insane. And so the story of Waterworld is inevitably wrapped up in the story of the finances of Waterworld. That's why, I think that's probably why we're talking about it today, why it's still talked about 25 years later, as much as it is the film itself.
Well, no, I agree, and I think your point about an idea that's able to be written on the back of a beer mat is interesting, because when I was watching the film, I was thinking exactly that in terms of this idea of it being high concept, the fact that it is, as you say, is right in the slap bang in the middle of the 1990s. I think one of the interesting things when I was reading a little bit around the film is its relationship to sort of merchandise, perhaps, or tie-ins and synergy, and the accompanying novelization, video game, theme park attractions, all this sort of stuff. It seems in many ways to be the sort of quintessential, in lots of ways actually, the quintessential 90s Hollywood blockbuster, if you're kind of reading around it. But then there's so much else on top of it, as you say, the escalating budget, the alleged sort of on-set rivalry between the director and Costner, and all these sorts of stories that have helped mythologize the film a little bit more and sort of take it beyond a standard Hollywood blockbuster, if such a thing exists.
Yeah, it landed slap bang in the middle of a change in Hollywood as well. That here was this hugely expensive practical film that everything you see in the film was built or was done. There's very little in the way of computer effects in it. 2 years before, Jurassic Park had come out at it cost about $65 million. Jurassic Park cost to realise, cost to make. And that was a film that revolutionised Hollywood thinking, that revolutionised merchandising far more than Waterworld ever would. That also, Waterworld was then followed a year later by Independence Day. And what those films changed, as well as a reliance on effects and on computer-driven visuals in the middle of blockbuster movies, was it took the reliance on the movie star out of it. That up until that point, it was, if you were going to spend an awful lot of money on a big movie, you would hire a movie star, because at least you would get an opening weekend. And what Jurassic Park and Independence Day proved, far more than Terminator 2 did, I'd argue, was that you don't need a star, that the special effects are universal. The visual effects are universal, and they sell irrespective of whether you happen to like or not the leading star of your movie. And in fact, you see it's come a little bit full circle with the Fast and Furious films, which have driven us back, no pun intended, towards a lot more practical work, although there's quite a lot of digital stuff in Fast and Furious as well. But again, Fast and Furious films don't sell the movie stars, really. They sell the car chases. So Waterworld, it was an anomaly, even at the point, really, as it was coming out, that in 1995, if you'd have asked a movie studio, will you spend $200 million on a film headlined by a movie star and not by a special effect, I think that would have caused far more meetings than it would have done a couple of years before.
I was going to say, I mean, the mid-90s context there, the as you say, it's sort of positioning just before the sort of latter, or certainly the late 90s work, the disaster movies, or the sort of post-disaster US movies, I think, more broadly. So, as you say, Independence Day, Deep Impact, Volcano, obviously Twister as well, 1996.
Yeah.
Armageddon. These are all, as you say, driven in lots and lots of ways by the effect. The effect is the star, and certainly Waterworld, the title of the film, the sort of the premise, the set pieces, and actually its relationship to digital technology is one of the things. If we think of Hollywood as then moving into CG, or moving perhaps more head first, or sort of diving into CG. Don't forget, I mean, this film comes out in July, and it's only a few months before the November release of Toy Story. Obviously, you mentioned Jurassic Park, and so you have these. And actually, I found myself, when I was watching the film, thinking about the stress it places on physicality or materiality on
Yes.
the film. I was trying to think, is it that the film suffers because it's not CGI? I don't think so. I think it's perhaps there's a lot of invisibility. The stuff that is CGI is perhaps, aside from one of the big kind of fish creaturey things, a lot of it is maybe invisible. It's erasing things, or it's creating a virtual backlot. It's not creating a central set piece. Everything seems to be, as you say, kind of physical or practical. It doesn't feel weightless. It feels weighty, and I like
Yeah.
that element of the film and how that maps onto. You have lines in the film about dry land. I've seen it. I've touched it, and it seems very much to be
Yeah.
about. I feel that when I watch the film, it seems like I can reach out and touch it and walk on the sets in a way that the sort of virtual imagery of Hollywood at the time, perhaps, it's less tangible or more immaterial.
But you look at what the big films were in 1995, just to contextualize it just a little bit more, even there's a hint of a change of the time, because the biggest film of the year at the global box office, once you take in international and American takings, was still Die Hard 3, was still Die Hard with a Vengeance, which did have some digital effects work in there, most notoriously in a moment where Bruce Willis walks around with a sign that had a racist message digitally added to it. So just because the safety of him shooting the scene without that's why they went down that road. But you look at, I mean, Toy Story is number 2, Apollo 13 was that year, Goldeneye was that year, Batman Forever, Seven, Jumanji. These were the top 10 movies of that particular year, once you take worldwide box office into account. In fact, Waterworld will come in at 9 in the top 10. But what's in common with lots of those is there's quite a lot of traditional Hollywood star power in there, and there's only a little bit of creep with something like Batman Forever of the reliance we were going to see on franchises and brands. And then, of course, Toy Story at number 2 was the grenade lobbed into the middle of Hollywood. But Toy Story, nobody saw coming, really. I mean, Toy Story was, I'm sure you've covered this an awful lot in the past, but Toy Story was the gamble, the absolute gamble that Disney and ahed over, and Pixar was struggling just to get it out of the door. It couldn't render it. The cost of it was obscene. No one was sure it was going to work. And Disney that year put all its chips on Pocahontas. In fact, Pocahontas went into production alongside The Lion King. And Pocahontas was the A picture, that all the best people were put on Pocahontas because that was the one that was going to be huge. And The Lion King, it had incredible people on it, as it proved, but that was the one where the expectations were lower. It was the same with Toy Story as well. So, I mean, it goes back a little bit to that old adage of nobody knows anything.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to making films, when it comes to predicting films. But it was a very turbulent, changing year for Hollywood, that was. And we talk about the thinness of just the idea, really, that just the high concept of the pitch. And you look down the list of films again that were coming that year. I mean, number 15 was Heat. And Heat was infamously pitched by Michael Mann of walking into Warner Brothers and saying Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, $65 million, and Warner Brothers just signed the check pretty much on the spot.
There's your film.
Yeah, well, basically, who would say no to that? I mean, the high concept, the high concept one that changed it really was Twins. If you want to go a bit further back, the pitch for that was the poster: Arnold Schwarzenegger, Danny DeVito, twins, and they signed the check on the spot. So Waterworld, I mean, he says I segued enormously already. We're only like 10 minutes in, aren't I? But Waterworld, the idea that it was just a very simple high concept pitch was to its benefit, really, in terms of getting it made. But it is worth putting in as well that Waterworld was originally conceived in the 80s as a much lower budget production. It was never supposed to be a film of this size, and it was only over its decade or so in Hollywood development that it turned into something else. So I've given you loads of strands to explore.
Love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's pick one. I think one of the things about thinking about the film as well as the stories that surround the film, because it's hard to watch it now without this sort of, meta narrative of, this infamous quote unquote Hollywood flop, quote unquote, even though it's probably neither of the two properly. But it's something, it's part of the lore of the movie. and it's almost like the film is partly that, because it's sitting in this, you know, transitional liminal period in Hollywood's history between different types of selling strategy, different types of marketing strategy, and indeed different types of filming strategy. You know, water is an interesting testing ground for sort of CGI in the way that, and this film kind of feeds into that, in that a lot of the stories that I seem to find, whether they're anecdotal or apocryphal or real, are about the struggle to film or not film the water, the sort of dodgy, vistas of water that are occasionally interspersed between actual vistas of water, and the stories of actors nearly drowning on physical sets, and when to build and when not to build. The film seems to sort of nicely help us to dramatize or articulate our changing relationship to, you know, what, you know, I guess us academics call the pro-filmic versus the sort of visualized, the real celluloid shot on camera versus the CGI special effects to put in post and pre.
I think the thing with Hollywood and water, though, is during that era, really, it was once a decade someone would have a go, and Hollywood would have a big go at it. Then they'd remember why they didn't have a go, just because it's hell. So you went from Jaws in the 70s to The Abyss in the 80s, and you just wait long enough for the memory of just how difficult it is to just erase from your head to have another try. Although the director of Waterworld, Kevin Reynolds, just before he did Waterworld, did a film called Rapa Nui, which he filmed on Easter Island, and they were so isolated making that film that they could only get supplies to the cast and crew delivered to them once a week. And so food and drink were running out on that one. So to go from what was supposed to be his small project in between Robin Hood and Waterworld to, hunger just to try and make a film, and then to Waterworld. I mean, it was a little bit of the proverbial frying pan into the fire. But in terms of how much was in camera with Waterworld, I think that's the thing that, as a film to sit and watch, that is the thing that continually lifts it for me. That I don't think it's a vintage Kevin Costner film, and I say that as a dyed-in-the-wool Costner fan, but I do think it's an enjoyable one, and I do think the physicality of it is there from the start right the way through. And there's little bits of digital work, and I think it's quite telling how much they stand out, because the rest of it is so real, really. I mean, there's no way. I wish I could come up with a breathtakingly intelligent way to say that, but they went and did it. They went and shot. They built these massive sets out on the water. They would drag them out to sea. They would do the filming. And one of the smaller sets infamously sunk. That would cause huge headlines in the Hollywood trade papers about what a disaster this film was going to be. And the budget ran over, etc., etc. But the one thing I think is pretty irrefutable is, whether you like Waterworld or not, they went and did that for real on a scale on water that I don't think has been done since. I mean, you look at what they did with Aquaman. They didn't even try it, did they, really? And Aquaman, to be fair, I'm not a mad fan of the film, but I do think it's beautiful to look at. But I don't often think, I didn't watch it and think I was necessarily underwater, because the water of Waterworld is miserable and choppy and grim and horrible. And it's just reminds me going to the seaside in Britain when I was a kid. You know, it just felt a lot more tangible to me.
Well, I mean, if we're thinking about all of the context in which we can sort of place the film and the, obviously, the blockbuster, the high concept blockbuster, we've got the mid-90s blockbusters that are veering towards disaster in all kinds of ways. We've got obviously the CG production, if Hollywood is sort of gradually and progressively moving. So it's interesting you mentioned The Abyss, which is often cited amongst effects histories as, one of the most important moments where we get an accurate simulation of a sort of watery creature. The film, does the film suffer, or does Waterworld suffer or feel different because it isn't sort of heavily CGI? We have, and I think maybe that's where the story, and actually what Alex said, the lore of the film that surrounds it, this narrative that surrounds the film, I think has sort of helped really emphasize the practicality and physicality and the weightiness of the sets. As you say, it's this grim portrayal of as I was watching it, I was thinking, he must be cold. He must be cold as he gets. And I think the last time I felt that was watching I think it's All Is Lost, the Robert Redford film, where
Yeah, that's a
But
terrific
that's what
film.
I was thinking, and that sort of element of survival, and there's and that the film's narrative about survival or extinction, this post-apocalyptic narrative, feeds quite nicely into the extra textual stuff around the film about it's trying to stay afloat, all this sort of stuff. The other context I was thinking of, and maybe this takes us a little bit, well, I don't know, a little bit towards fantasy, is as I was watching it, I was thinking Cutthroat Island, which is of course 1995.
Yeah, yeah.
Rennie Harlin, who's interesting because of
Yes.
he went on to direct. Did he go on to direct Deep Blue Sea in 19?
Yeah, Deep Blue Sea would follow 4 years later. He came to Cutthroat Island off Cliffhanger and The Long Kiss
So this
Goodnight, wasn't it? Those are the other ones he was
yeah, this
making
is
around then.
90s action cinema par excellence, and obviously he has a relationship
Yeah.
to the Die Hard franchise, which you mentioned here.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I was thinking about the swashbuckler genre, which this film, and again reading up on Waterworld, it sort of seems to suggest that we don't return to that genre. We don't, go back to the high seas until something like Pirates of the Caribbean, which opens up a whole, again, a sort of post-millennial relationship between Hollywood and the theme park ride and all these sorts of things. So it seems increasingly that Waterworld is perhaps, and it's more than just a film that did terribly, or one of the ways that it's been sidelined in critical, certainly of visual effects. It just seems to be quote unquote the greatest flop in the history when actually it seems more than that. It seems to do a lot of stuff. And so, yeah, I was thinking its mid-90s position seems really important and significant to the way that we understand the film as a whole.
There's a couple of points in there. One of which, I mean, Cutthroat Island is a whole different, interesting example because I mean that was being made by a company that was going out of business and fast. And at that point, I think the last big pirate movie had been Polanski's, I think, in '86, and that had failed. And pirate films were box office poison until Pirates of the Caribbean came along. And again, it's easy to overlook just what a huge gamble Pirates of the Caribbean, the first one, was. But yeah, it's pretty deliberate that Waterworld didn't veer that way, and I think Cutthroat Island. I mean, it was originally going to be Michael Douglas, I think, and that might have transformed it into something a little bit different. But that was a whole adventure in its own right that just went wrong. In the case of Waterworld, the narrative about money. Again, we come back to it again. It's quite telling, really, that it does come back to that. I read an article, at least 3-4 articles a year from people who just put in the notorious flop Waterworld, or one of the biggest flops of all time, Waterworld. This massive box office turkey, Waterworld, and that's just false. Whatever you think of the film, the financials, and there's an argument about how invested audience members should be in the financials, really, but we're here, and I've been invested and interested in this for a while. The actual financials show that it was a profitable film, but that doesn't make as good a story, really. But again, it comes back to, I think, why this film keeps coming up again and again and again and again, because factually Waterworld ran over budget. Factually, Waterworld was the most expensive film of all time at the point it was released, and factually, it didn't break $100 million at the American box office after all of that. I think it did about 88 or something like that. And so it wasn't the huge juggernaut that all concerned were hoping for. However, it was and is a profitable film, and it's not my money on the line. So there's a limit to how hard I'll argue this point, because ultimately it comes part down to the fact that it did actually bring in the money, and part down to how massive corporations do their accounting, which I can get into a little bit if you want me to go down there and talk about just why it wasn't a flop. But it comes down to, I think, that remains just wrapped up in the story of this particular film.
Well, I think why it was perceived as a flop might be the question to ask, because as it did make money, but my understanding is it made money sort of post cinema sales. So perhaps listeners would like to know sort of what the mechanics behind that is.
It's not unusual for films to make money post cinema sales. There was an argument. I think it was Kevin Smith who who just explained that a cinema release is ultimately the trailer for the video or subsequent DVD release. If you look at something like The Bourne Identity, if you look at the first Austin Powers film, they were massively profitable films on their theatrical release, because by the time you've taken the cinemas cut out of it, the distribution cost, the higher cost of distributing outside of the home country of the film, everyone takes a slice. And the studio's looking to get, if a film grosses $100 million worldwide and the studio gets its paws on 40 million of that, that's quite a good result, really, certainly in the 90s. And as a consequence, it was quite hard for any film of any size, really, to make its money back entirely off its theatrical run. I mean, Die Hard 2, when that, we're talking Rennie Harlin just before, that was, 1990, and that infamously cost $75-80 million to make, which, again, no one had spent that kind of money on a film at that point. And I remember reading articles, I've gone back and seen some of them, talking about how can a film that costs that much money ever make its money back? And it didn't on its cinema release, because it couldn't, because at that point the distribution model and the expectations of the return of a Die Hard film, they just weren't going to deliver the 300 million or something it would have needed for that to fully break even at the box office. But that's not what the movie business was or is. And you look at a whole collection of films that have gone on to be hugely profitable, and it's the home release, it's the ancillaries, it's the merchandising, it's all the bits and bobs that go around it. You look at, every time you're on a plane and you see a film showing, that the movie studio's got money for that. When you see the film come on BBC One or something like that, the movie studio's got money for that. There are trains in theatre, well, usually there are trains going up and down the country now, the way you can sit and watch a film that's beamed to you on the train, and that's a revenue stream for the studio. So that in itself isn't unusual. What was unusual in the midst of Waterworld that made it slightly different was it was pretty much profitable from the off because of a corporate takeover that was going on in the midst of it all, that the parent company behind Waterworld, Universal Pictures, was being sold to another company at that time. And as a consequence of that, and I'm no accountant, so take this with a little bit of salt, the parent company of Universal at the time, MCA, was bought by the Seagram company. Seagram bought 80% of Universal. And part and parcel of that, I dug into this a long time ago, so I might be a little bit rusty on it. MCA's previous owners, Matt Schuster, I think it's pronounced, agreed to hold on to $1 billion of Universal's then debts. And part of that was the production cost of Waterworld. So by the time it came out, Universal Pictures had a new owner who basically hadn't paid for the film. And it was estimated that Seagram, which was Universal's new majority owner, had put something like 10-12 million in to Waterworld, and that was it. And then the film goes and grosses quarter of $1 billion worldwide. So from that point on, thanks to some accounting shenanigans, it was profitable from the off for the studio that actually released it. Now, in ordinary times, had that takeover not been going on, Waterworld would have taken years to make its money back, but it would have made its money back. It was a big Kevin Costner movie in the 90s, even though his star was slightly big. Well, it was beginning to fall at that point. It was greenlit off the back of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and The Bodyguard and films such as that, his biggest commercial successes, and Universal knew that a big Kevin Costner summer movie, even if it did badly, was going to do quite well. And I think that's pretty much what it did. It did quite well, and it returned a modest profit off its theatrical release, and then by the time you factor everything else in, it's a profitable film. I mean, no one was clamoring for a sequel, but it absolutely wasn't and isn't a flop.
Yeah, well, it seems like the idea of scale then, which traditionally, certainly within, I think, academic discourse and cultural perception of the blockbuster, is that it is rooted in scale in whatever form it's sold on the basis of it being an event. And your point about the films becoming the trailers of kind of the post-cinema afterlives of these films, and this idea of the pre-sold pleasure, which again supports blockbuster economics. You have the film that is the sequel to the original that was originally based on a television program. I'm thinking of Mission Impossible, is like the quintessential, with Cruise quite literally, if the posters are anything to go by, the face of the franchise. But we have this idea of this event, and so it seems like, again, the way that Waterworld has sort of fallen into this sort of blockbuster discourse is simply because it was big and epic, and the idea of scale is connected to it in all kinds of ways, because the set was huge, the budget went over, that everything about the film was big. And so the way that spectacle and spectacular imagery and scale and this sort of lavishness of these big blockbuster movies and their accompanying audiovisual sort of sensations, again, it seems like Waterworld should be very much part of this conversation beyond it being dismissed as something that was this big disaster. That's why the Simpsons joke about the Waterworld video game is that has consolidated what people think about and audiences think about that movie, that you put lots and lots and lots and lots of money in, play the game for 5 seconds, and that's it, game over.
Okay, so this is one of those moments where we pause the podcast and stop talking as we were then, and start talking live. Well, not live, but
we're always live and not live.
This is
it's hard to record in advance of the moment that you're recording.
Sure, this isn't a live stream.
No,
so
that's not what we've paused the podcast to talk to you about.
No, we have paused the podcast to talk to you, listeners and potential contributors, actually, about the blog element of the website. So if you visit fantasy-animation.org, you'll see that we run a weekly blog. So the blog itself pulls in different voices from lots of different places, whether you're an animator, creative practitioner, academic, whether you've been to a film festival, an academic conference, whether you are, been to the cinema, seen an animated fantasy television program. We'd love
to be an animator who's just produced new work and wants to talk about it, reflect on it creatively.
It could be
someone who's trying to get into film journalism, who wants to have a go at writing a review. You could just be a fan and love a particular subject matter, and you'd always want to talk about it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people kind of get in contact via the website. We have a little comments function, so if you send a little message to us with your potential idea, then we'll have a conversation about commissioning in it.
There's a tab, isn't there, at the top that says something like contact us and submit form. Click
so
on
you
that.
can contact us. And also you can follow us on social media, so give us an @ on Facebook, send us a message. So give us an @ on Twitter or send us a message on Facebook and we'll get in touch. It would be great to kind of publish some of the new work that's being done or hear from people that perhaps wouldn't have the opportunity to publish elsewhere. Get in touch.
Please do. Otherwise, we'll just get back to the show.
Let's.
The thing, though, is, ultimately with a film in the build-up to its release, and we saw this with Titanic as well, what the trade press was and is interested in is, does it make good copy? And in the build-up to the release of Titanic, all the same cliches were coming out, that this is going well over budget, this is going to be a disaster, this is huge, this is blah, 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 blah. And it's a good story when a huge studio film is going wild, is going heavily over budget, appears to have all sorts of problems, and people just want to read the story. I'm the same. I'm interested in film productions that go well. I'm interested in film productions that go badly. I'm just curious about the magic, I believe, of putting a film together. And so in the case of Waterworld, by the time it came out, its place in film history was secured, I would suggest, before anyone actually saw a frame of it, because the stories had dominated the trade press in the build-up to its release. It was called, it was being dubbed Fish Tar, wasn't it? And Kevin's Gate. And Costner had come up against this before with Dances with Wolves, where he went off and did what the trade press were describing as a folly. He, at the peak of his powers, he turned down the Hunt for Red October, went to make Dances with Wolves, took this gamble, made this foreign language, basically a film of which a third of which was in a foreign language, and he emerged triumphant from that. And so there's also an element, I'd suggest, of the movie star at the top of his powers who was ready to be shot down. So all these things were coming together with the movie. And again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've been chatting for, half an hour about this, but we're not talking about the film. We're talking about the story around the film. And I think because of the way Waterworld was reported on before, during, and after, I think that just has informed the narrative around it. And I interviewed the director of the film, Kevin Reynolds, about a decade ago, and he says he remembered going to the press screening for the first press screening of the film and walking out and overhearing someone say, "Well, that's a shame. That was quite good." Because it just didn't fit. It didn't fit the story that some people at that point wanted to write. So there was all that going on around it. And then in the midst of it all, there was the human drama of the second blow up between its star and its director. And that also inflamed this already hot topic in the Hollywood trade press. And that became part of its infamy in the build up to the release again.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I think that's the other bit of the meta narrative. I do want to talk about the film, but let's just continue on with this sort of thread, which is the other bit of the meta narrative seems to be this thing of Costner is out of control, movie star out of control narrative, which again is a sort of one that seems to have been played out in the trade presses over and over again in various releases. Either the brat director is out of control, a la Heaven's Gate, or the star is taking control and therefore derailing the film. And this seems to be a nice sort of toxic combination of both in terms of the behind the scenes stuff. Am I right?
Yeah, I think it might be slightly the opposite,
Right.
in that it's not that he was out of control. I think he was too in control.
Yeah, sure.
I think that was probably it, because Reynolds and Costner were best friends at one point. They'd worked together on Fandango in the 80s, and then Warner Brothers, Morgan Creek Productions, used the bait really of getting Kevin Reynolds to direct Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, to lure Costner to that project. I think it's pretty well known they fell out after that. Reynolds didn't sign off the final cut of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and was not in the edit room as the final cut was put together. Then they made up, and then they came to Waterworld, and they had an even bigger falling out in the midst of it. And around the time of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and the fallout there, I remember reading a quote from a studio insider that said, because this was just after Dances with Wolves had won its Oscars, there's still an Academy Award-winning director called Kevin on this picture. And you're just like, oh, okay. And it is true that Costner, I think it was after Revenge. Revenge was the last film at that point he felt he hadn't had control of, and that it didn't go quite the way he wanted it to go. And so subsequent to that, he was producing the vast bulk of the films that he made. So he was always that involved. And he's not alone for a movie star with that. If you put Harrison Ford on a project, he will come in and he will expect, and rightly, expect to have his say on the film, and he will shape the character and he'll shape the narrative. And it's the same with indie films as well, et cetera, et cetera. But Costner was a Hollywood power player at that point. And he was the reason, ultimately, if we're being blunt, the film got made. It was the reason the checks got written for the film. And at the point the film started to go off-piste, if you like, that it was going over budget, and that Reynolds and Costner had slightly different ideas of which way it was going to go, there's only one person who was ever going to win that fight. The then biggest movie star in the world and the director. And it was just an uneven fight on that one. And it made good copy. And I don't get any sense that Kevin Costner is an easy person to work with. I've never met the man, so I can't say one way or the other. It is worth pointing out that Reynolds and Costner reconciled again and worked together on the television miniseries Hatfield and McCoy's, which Reynolds then directed. And they seemed to get along a lot better on that one. But then there was less water, I presume. That might help. I don't know.
Always a useful way of repairing relationships.
Yeah.
Keep things dry. Yes, well, indeed, yeah, and it all seems to feed into the sort of wider story. So to sort of redirect things and focus on the film, I hadn't seen it in, I don't know, I think I probably saw it as a sort of teenager on renting it from Blockbuster once or twice when it was out, but I haven't seen it since. And the abiding memory I have is going to Universal Studios and seeing the spectacular stunt show, which I believe is still going.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Adding to that ancillary sort of stuff you were saying earlier, that thing's still going live and well, and is a really great show. But that's sort of what I was going to say. I was going to sort of put my fantasy hat on for a second and start trying to talk about the film in terms of what it does well and what perhaps it has problems with in terms of on-screen stuff, and particularly in terms of the aspect of the world building going on. So we've got this high concept story of a world without land, a world of water. And what I was struck by watching it from the opening sequence is the sort of gag almost with the Universal logo, where it goes into the world on the Universal logo, and the world slowly, the land disappears, and we have this featureless landscape of water. And it made me sort of think about something that I then thought about for the rest of the movie, which is it's very difficult to build a fantasy world when the number one feature of this fantasy world is that it's featureless. Essentially, what you've got here is a barren landscape of sea, and the film does a lot of interesting things to try to sort of build, a world. And whilst I'm sort of, a huge fan of these sort of 80s high fantasies that build these sort of lavish landscapes by highlighting the topography of everything, from, characters run from deserts to lush jungles, and it gives this great sense of sort of, contrast and sort of spectacle in landscape. Well, none of that can be achieved here in Waterworld because the landscape is the lack of landscape.
Yeah.
For me, the best bit is the sort of first 25 minutes where we have this Mad Max floating island, where what we've got is a sort of celebration of sets, and sets become spectacle in a sort of Wizard of Oz-esque way, in that it's artificial. The artificial construction feeds into the story because the story is of a world artificially constructed on top of a featureless world, and then that whole sequence is really great, and then we have problems afterwards. So am I the only one that thought the sort of film's main energy was in those sort of first half an hour, or does it still appeal beyond that?
I would. I mean, I think Waterworld is a flawed film. I think narratively you can punch holes in it. I think it's too long. I think the characters aren't brilliantly drawn, really. I mean, you don't come to the end of them. And I always come back to something like Aliens on something like this. The first time I watched the film Aliens, I walked out the cinema and could have named 7 characters off the top of my head. Just because I felt I got to know. I couldn't do that with Waterworld. I know that he's the mariner, but ironically, I know his name because he's not got a name. I think Reynolds is a tremendously underrated director of action. I do think that. And I think it has a lot of fun with the early setup. And when the action goes on to these huge sets, these gigantic sets, and they're clearly doing very difficult stunts, I think it's really something. And I think later, as we get to meet Dennis Hopper's Deacon leading the Smokers, I mean, Dennis Hopper was cast so late in the day as well. I think genuinely they just watched Speed, which is how he ended up playing the villain in Waterworld.
He just watched Speed, and that's
but I think when they do these big, huge physical action sequences, I really think there's something to them. Whenever they stop and explain things, I don't think it helps, really, because again, it's quite simple, really, what it's actually trying to do. I don't remember sitting through the highlights of the Mad Max series. I think there's 3 brilliant films in the Mad Max series, and none of them are weighed down by too much exposition. They give you the bare threads of what you need to know and just get driving and do it brilliantly. And I think when Waterworld is at its best, it's moving in some way, that there's action going on, that there's things happening. There's the sense, I think, that when you arrive at a location, that location has been working before you got there. I think that comes down to the physicality of it as well. And I think the action stuff is really exciting and really good. And also, there's something in it, in that at that stage, I don't think many times since, I felt like I hadn't seen stuff like this. I felt like I hadn't seen big action sequences in boats. I felt like I hadn't seen big action sequences of its ilk on these huge floating sets, as you say. So, I mean, the roundabout way of answering you is, I think there's an argument that it's at its best in its first half hour, and I do think it's bloated. But also, I think there's sparks right throughout the film. I mean, there's daft decisions in there. The fixation was on the gills, wasn't there, behind the ears and stuff like that. And the digital bits do just strike out quite a lot. But conversely, it's doing something at heart tremendously ambitious, not on a storytelling level, but just on a sheer filmmaking level. And when it cuts into those sequences, I really do think that's something.
I absolutely, I think the ambition and the ambitiousness of the film is kind of tremendous. And actually, I hadn't really thought about the issue of world building. How do you build a fictional world on water and give it these, a fictional world needs to have a history. It needs to have characters whose knowledge of it is partial or incomplete. A ruin suggests that there is a history to this world and perhaps a reason why something has fallen in ruins. What do people fight over? They fight over cultural differences, religion, right? Does this world have a religion? religion? What are the structures? All these sorts of things that are in play that absolutely I agree that there is a sense that the fictional world sort of began before we arrived. Equally, I think Alex's point about that the film itself becomes a film about the restoration of a fictional world. So the opening universal sort of the playfulness of that, and I love a bit where the film intrudes into the logo. I love a bit of that. So the as you say, the sort of flooding of the Universal logo right at the start, that sort of playful gesture to what the situation is, that's then matched with the voiceover, the future, the polar ice caps melted.
It's proper grave voiceover as well, isn't it? It's all the gravel comes out.
And then you get the line, that we need to adapt to a new world. And my first note was, okay, so it's we can make the argument this film is about adaptation. It's the film has to adapt to an era in which there are CGI and all this sort of stuff. I was thinking, but then I thought just kind of practically, the building, as Alex said, of the fictional world, how you create a fictional world on water. The film becomes about the restoration of a civilization, and perhaps their history isn't that old. It's relatively new, and people are still learning the rules of their own world, and they're trying to figure out kind of bits and bobs, and they've just created a civilization, and then that gets disrupted by sort of the arrival of a man. Then you learn a little bit about what constitutes money and capital and all those sorts of things, and some of it is terrific. And I thought, I wonder what would have happened if this one could have been made same year as Pirates of the Caribbean. The range of characters, the sets, some of the set pieces, which often hinge on capture or escape or hijack, which I think is really great. I just wonder whether or not this issue of world building is that then, or if the film feels in any way incomplete, but in terms of its world building, is this because that the film swelled again in scale to 3 hours or whatever plus, and then was cut down, and there's a sense that we're missing all this backstory to characters here and there that might have fleshed out the world a little bit?
I think it's been proven that we're missing a different version of Waterworld by the fact that there are now 3 cuts of the movie that have been released on Blu-ray. The television cut, Reynolds' original ending for the movie, and the theatrical version. I do think one thing we've not done is it's worth contextualising just the whole polar ice caps melting and that narrative. In the context of the mid-90s, that was the first time that environmentalism had really bubbled up as a political topic, because that was the first rise of the Green Party in European elections was around this time. And so that was always part and parcel of, I think, why it got made, that they thought they were hitching a wagon to something that was deemed to be a hot topic at that point as well. And as a consequence, that people would instantly lock into the idea that polar ice caps melt, the world floods. And just the whole simplicity of the idea was, to a degree, being played out in newspaper articles suggesting that's the way the world could go at the time. I'm not saying Waterworld is a massive political statement, but I do think there was something in there before it was, no pun intended, watered down. And you can tell that by the original ending as well, that there was more of a mythos to it, I think, in one of the alternative cuts of the movie, in that. And I think I can say this because it's the ending that isn't in the actual film. But if you're averse to knowing anything of any endings, it's probably worth doing a spoiler warning here. So here's a little spoiler. The original ending of the film, and Kevin Reynolds told me this about again when I spoke to him. There's a point at the end where they would have been standing on dry land, and the little girl would have cleared away the grass, and would have found a plaque, and the plaque would have said, "Here near this spot, 1953, Norgay and Hillary first sets foot on the summit of Everest." And the whole idea was only the highest point on the planet would have been left as dry land. The top of Mount Everest was all you were getting. Such was the severity of the flooding. And Reynolds envisaged that to be his Planet of the Apes moment. The Statue of Liberty in Planet of the Apes. And so there was that level of thought. That's the point I'm trying to make it. Whatever comes across in the final cut. And it was a big studio action movie, ultimately. And so the final cut needed to service that more than any other master, and I think it did. But there was a broader ecosystem around this film. There was a more fleshed out world than the one that we ultimately got to see, and I just think it was just pared down by the demands of it being a studio blockbuster.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I hadn't thought to talk about that, but it's a really important thing to highlight, which is this interplay between science fiction and current science fact. I mean, right now there's this the oft quoted thing that people are saying right now, isn't it? Is that sales of Contagion are through the roof because everyone's revisiting that movie for its sort of
because we run towards things like that for some reason.
Yeah, that documentary that was made a few years ago, it seems. But that sort of, there's a long history of that, right? Of these of Hollywood harnessing cultural fears of the future, and playing out that narrative for everyone's own amusement. I mean, this is Day After Tomorrow is the same thing later, right? It's snowy rather than wet. This idea, and I think you're right. I think that's part of the selling point, isn't it? Is that this is a movie that's tapping into a prescient cultural fear of the time.
I think with Day After Tomorrow as well, again, just a minor segue. One of the things about that is the director of that film, Roland Emmerich, was said to have absolutely educated himself on the actual science of global warming and of the freezing of the world, of the coming of another ice age. And he knew all this stuff inside out and just ignored it because he knew it wouldn't make the film that he wanted to put on screen. But he went and found all the stuff out and worked out what facts to ignore. And that's part of storytelling, isn't it? Whatever you think of it, I mean, Day After Tomorrow is just a hoot of a film. All sorts of problems, but wildly entertaining for what it is. But conversely, there's the cherry picking of it, isn't it? You cherry pick the science and you cut into the bit that you think will most easily resonate with an audience. I think once you get to the films of this size.
I had a question that maybe ties in your love of Kevin Costner / Waterworld with your sort of work with magazines. And I was thinking about connoisseurship, and I was thinking about fandom and obviously the way that, and the story that you told about the people coming out of the film having already known what it was going to be in terms of this disaster in all kinds of ways, and then people come out and say, oh, actually it was quite good, it was a shame that it's sort of quite good. I just wondered, is there a sense in which, I think I'm trying to think if I've got this right or not. This sort of the rise of sort of like effects magazines generally, and you get effects technology certainly in the digital side from the 80s into the 90s. And is there a sense in which part of the reason that, I don't know, our audience is becoming savvier in terms of effects? There was an LA Times article from May 95 that was based on a sort of, I think it was a pre-screening or an unfinished cut of the film or something. And the journalist talks about audiences left feeling, quote, unimpressed with the special effects. And I just wondered whether there was something around effects magazines, film journalism in the 90s, where people are becoming more and more knowledgeable about special effects and the technologies that are used to produce them, and their expectations are getting higher and higher, and so they're able to make judgments about films in a way that they hadn't been able to judge before. And actually that's part of the reason maybe that Waterworld suffered in terms of its effects, because you mentioned earlier that its CG effects do stand out, and I was surprised at the end how much the blue screen, green screen or whatever looks so artificial. But I really just a question about sort of, I guess, the connoisseurship of audiences at the time, and whether or not they are in a better place, whatever that means, to sort of make a pass or judgment on the effects themselves.
I think I don't know. I slightly go the other way on it. I remember when my favourite film in my teens was Back to the Future Part 2, and I devoured everything I could read on it. And there was a making of book that was a bit better than your usual cookie cutter thing at the time. And in that, its director Robert Zemeckis said, "I don't want people thinking about how things were done until they're on the way out the cinema," because he knew people would think about that. And this was pre-DVD extras and stuff like that, as was Waterworld. And so the actual how films were made was still something of a mystery. And so I think there's an element of that. But also a couple of years later, just to go on a slightly different example, there's a film came out called Air Force One. And Air Force One is Harrison Ford and Gary Oldman and
Director Wolfgang Peterson.
yeah, Wolfgang Peterson, and a huge hit movie. And no one talks about the effects in that film because the film worked for them. And yet, I would argue, at the end of Air Force One, there is one of the dodgiest digital effects I've seen on a big screen in my life, up there with the Mummy Returns ending. The difference is, I think, Air Force One worked better as a blockbuster movie, ultimately, and that's why it doesn't become a conversation point. If you're sat there looking at something and something completely takes you out of the film, then there's a fault with the film. Generally, it's a very crude and simplistic way to do it, but something about the film isn't working if you can be pulled out of it that easily, really. Now, of course, sometimes effects are so glaring that the argument doesn't hold, and I do think it sticks out just by the contrast between digital and physical in Waterworld, that when it does something digital, you do sit there and think, oh, hang on, that's a bit odd, isn't it? But conversely, we're sitting here talking about that 25 years later, and I would argue that's because that bit of the film didn't work for you or didn't work for it. It just didn't feel as real as the rest of it. Contrast that with Air Force One. Go and ask 100 people, did you have any problem with the ending of Air Force One? And don't tell them it's the digital effects. I'd be surprised if you get more than a couple who just cite it as an effects problem. So I think it's quite it's both a simple and a complex question with a simple and a complex answer, really. But if you're sat there and you're thinking, oh, hang on, then something's gone wrong with the film.
There's an interesting interplay with that, though, I think, in that that's true. But I also think Hollywood likes to present a rhetoric of believability, I think, which I'm always, as a fantasy scholar, I'm always trying to reconcile with, because they like to present themselves as these sort of, as you say, magicians who are able to convince us of things we should not be convinced by. And the magic of the film is our ability to suspend that idea of disbelief. And I just don't think that quite articulates the complexity of being a film spectator, because actually part of the pleasure in a film like Waterworld, or in any kind of fantasy or sci-fi or any kind of alternative world on screen, is that feeling of disjunct, because it shouldn't feel normal. It shouldn't feel believable in the way that life is believable. It should have a certain element of, wow, how did they do that? So the flip side of what you're saying is that actually not, feeling like you're in the presence of some sort of movie mechanics can often enhance our appreciation of the movie as well as pull it away. So it's when moments do one and when moments do the other that's always the fascinating thing to try and unpick.
I also think that ties to internal logic, doesn't it? I mean, if we're talking fantasy, none of us really believes that Mordor exists.
Well, I hope not. Certainly.
Well, maybe it does. But none of us ultimately believes Mordor exists. And yet the spectacle of the Lord of the Rings films and the internal logic of them works. We know we're getting a piece of fantasy when we go through the door to watch those films, and that world holds. I'd also say the same with something like, let's pick a more recent, Alita Battle Angel. I think the world building in that is absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And I look at it and I just say, I know this is elevated, I know this isn't real, etc., etc. But I get the internal logic of the world that you're holding together. And whatever you think of that film, I think the world building in it just strings together and just works. So yeah, the spectacle is. I think the spectacle a lot of the time is the sale, isn't it? That's what gets you in. You go back to that shot of Independence Day of the White House blowing up, which was a model, wasn't it? It wasn't even a digital effect, really. But you were sold on the spectacle. That's what primarily gets you through the door. And obviously you go away and you talk about those spectacle moments, and seeing them on a big screen is amazing. But conversely, once you start there, it's like 2 hours, two and a half hours. There has to be something a little more. I go back to Aquaman actually, because I remember when the first bunch of reviewers came out of seeing Aquaman, and the thing that was popping up on social media is, oh, it's so nuts that there's this bit where an octopus is banging a drum. I was just like, oh, that sounds interesting. And so I watched the film, and sure enough, there's an octopus banging a drum in it. But I just thought, you've put that moment in to distract from how dull the rest of this film is, and to give, this 20-second moment that you can talk about to make it sound like it's wacky or it's out there or something like that. And it's just not. It's just not, in my view. I know some people love Aquaman, and if you do, that's great.
The sort of counter to that one would then, to go back to an earlier reference, would be sort of Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah.
Where we get that shot of the electric guitarist on top
Yeah.
of the... you just sort of go with it. You're like, yes, that's the moment you go, I am in. I am all in. You've managed to convince me that that is a credible sight within this insane sort of hyperbolic world. So it's a sort of interesting yin and yang to the octopus playing a drum. There's some sentence I think I'd say today.
It is simple, isn't it? It's like, do you buy it while you're there? That's it. It doesn't matter how out there it is. And we talk about novelty. I mean, you brought up novelty a little bit, and I do think that ties to Toy Story the same year. And you can almost see the curve of audience novelty just with the technology, in that the first tranche of fully CG movies all made a fortune. Come what may, the Ice Age films were making a fortune. The first DreamWorks films all made a fortune. The first Pixar films all made a fortune. And it took about 7-8 years for audience fatigue to really set in with fully CG films. And that's no slight on the films that were successes at the time, but the sheer novelty factor kept those going for a long time. But eventually the novelty tires. So I know I've slightly undercut my point there a little bit, but nonetheless, it is just this cauldron of lots of little things, really.
I have a few things. One is that I must be the only person on the planet, and I wasn't going to say this until you mentioned it, but I must be one of the only people on the planet that didn't get Fury Road, and I've just outed myself to the world. Or the people that listen.
Listeners, you've now listened to the final episode of the podcast. It's been a fun run.
Yeah, I didn't. Anyway, so I was going to say that I was the other point I was going to make was about kind of models and believability, because isn't there the sequence from the second Austin Powers where he goes to blow up the White House and then says, "Oh, actually, that was just a scene from the movie Independence Day, but the real explosion will be a lot like that," which really nice, and which the gag is then I think repeated in the the most recent of the Die Hard movies, to go back to that franchise, 4.0, where there is a model of a building that it's the same principle. Oh, I think it's a model. And Bruce Willis runs around going, "No, don't worry, it's a model. It's a model," which I quite like as a reflexive gesture to the sort of believability and the credibility of images. The third thing I was going to say was, it goes back to your point about computer animated films, and yes, there was a fatigue, and the fatigue was around 2005, 2006.
It's Chicken Little, wasn't it? That was when it started to set in.
Yeah, 2005. That's the release of that was 2005. There was an article in Variety which was talking about fatigue, and it was because 2005 and 2006. So Chicken Little, Cars, Over the Hedge. It was around a group of movies that there was I think there was a concentration of computer animated films that was up on previous years, and suddenly we were getting the same old. So I remember that. I remember that moment, that kind of fatigue. But the point, what I was gonna say that wasn't anything to do with any of that, and especially nothing to do with Fury Road, which was, I think that part of the reason that for me that the visual effects of Waterworld stood out, as in the digital visual effects stood out for me, was one, I was, the quality of them is what they are. They're kind of a little bit clumsy in some ways, but I just wasn't expecting the digital. The film had sort of set me up for these practical, weighty effects, and so all my notes are about the film's not digital, and then over the page I've got, and then a CG shark thing with the marine, and then they eat it, and then I was like, oh, so it does have digital effects in it. And then the whole, I think the final set piece, so the rescue of Enola, the destroying of the sort of Deacon in his army, really is green and blue screen, and I think there's a lot of sort of CG work. But I think it just stood out to me, not necessarily because of its what Laura Mulvey would call the clumsy sublime of back projection. I think it was just I was just not expecting a film that had been so weighty and watery and material and physical, and to be sort of filtered through these ideas of actor stamina and fortitude as they sort of wrangle with these practical sets, to suddenly shift its register and be digital in a way I wasn't expecting.
I would agree with that. I mean, there's not an awful lot I can add to that, because, yeah, I think it's right. I think all of a sudden it changed what it was selling you, really, and how it was doing it. And even though those sequences had some really excellent stunt work in it, yeah, it just pulled the rug. Because I can't add anything to that, I will just go back to your Austin Powers anecdote, though, in that you say it built up to the White House moment and the White House explosion and was having fun with the idea of spectacle. I don't think any film has done that better than Spice World, the movie, actually.
We have covered some topics today. We have covered some topics.
Well, there's a bit in Spice World, the movie. I remember laughing like a drain at the cinema when it did it, where it's building up to this double-decker London bus having to jump over Tower Bridge as the bridge is coming up, and that they do all these cuts backwards and forwards and say that's big, that sounds expensive, and then when it cuts to the actual shot, it just does blatantly, and it's deliberate, a toy bus on a toy bridge just doing the jump. I just thought that's a really clever way to subvert all our expectations and to save yourself about £5 million in the process, I think. On Mad Max, what I would say, I'm not going to argue you on Fury Road. If it didn't work for you, it didn't work for you. That's cool. But if you go back to the Road Warrior, the second Mad Max movie, that cost what, about 6-7? I don't have the number off the top of my head. I think it was under $10 million or something to make. I think that is a more successful narrative film than Waterworld, and I think it's doing pretty much the same thing. Waterworld is heavily derived from the Mad Max films, as we said, but the issue of scale and the issue of budgets turned Waterworld into something else. The actual core of it, I would suggest, was done for about a 15th of the price with no water a long time before and more successfully.
Yeah. I mean, just to round things off, I wondered if you could then pick out, given all that we've said and all that you've said about the film and its sort of production and its aesthetics and its legacy and all that sort of stuff, is there a particular sort of scene or sequence that is for you the bit that really, you know, is Waterworld for you in a nutshell?
No, not really. Just that what we were saying before, really. I absorbed the action stuff of it. I absorbed the bit where the camera's willing to pull back and let us see these actors and stunt performers running around these enormous sets, dragged out into not quite the middle of the ocean, but far enough of the ocean to make you feel a bit sick. And just letting the camera soak that up and then seeing all that on a big screen. And it's that degree of spectacle that always got me with it. And so, yeah, maybe I'll align myself with that idea, that first half hour or so, and just sitting there and taking it all in. But in truth, this was a film, for all the hour or so of chat we've had about it, that sold it to me off the back of two words. One of those was Kevin and the other was Costner, and I was in.
Yeah. I'm thrilled that we got a chance to kind of certainly I don't pretend to be. When you were mentioning all the Costner films, both of you at the start, I was thinking my knowledge of Kevin Costner is terrible, and I think I've seen Robin Hood, and I saw him in a recent film called Criminal, where he played like a brain transplanted into memories or something. But I certainly don't pretend to be the Costner aficionado. But Waterworld was something that same as the audiences perhaps at the time, I felt like I knew all about the film, having never seen it, and so I was really sort of
that's interesting. Well, let me recommend one for you then. The one that people don't tend to seek out. It's a film called 13 Days.
Oh yeah.
And we talk about the physicality of movies. If you want to look at it from just a sheer physicality point of view, it was made on an enormous set. I mean, it is a physical film, as he tends to make. But this was the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a film that he was originally set to direct, but ultimately didn't. It was directed by Roger Donaldson, who also directed a brilliant Costner film called No Way Out from the 80s. Yeah. But seek out 13 Days and have a look at that, because that's the kind of film that only gets made at that scale with a movie star clout.
Yeah.
And did.
Well, I like Donaldson important because I'm a big fan of Dante's Peak from 1997,
I was talking about that earlier today. Yeah,
and I've also seen The November Man, which is a more recent.
yes, there was supposed to be a sequel to that,
with-
but the first one virtually disappeared, which stopped it. It's Pierce Brosnan, isn't it?
Yeah. So no, I'll brush up on Costner. Alex, any final thoughts, words?
Yeah, I want to watch Twister now. I've been staring at it on my DVD shelf.
Twister. And I bet you, if we talk about Twister, there's one moment that will just spring to the top of your head.
The cow.
Which pretty much proves everything we've talked about to a degree for the last hour and so. Yeah, it's the cow. One moment. That's it.
I'm going to go watch Twister and remind myself whether it's Bill Paxton or Bill Pullman in it. That's a cheap. It's quite easy to tell the difference, but for some reason we like it. Simon, you've been really generous with your time and your knowledge. I'm sure a lot of people already are downloading film stories and reading the magazine, but if any of our listeners don't know about the project, could you just give them a quick heads up on it? And I'm sure there's lots of we have a lot of master's students, PhD students, BA film students who I'm sure would be very interested in it.
Briefly then, the podcast tells the behind-the-scenes stories of 2 films every week. I kind of go into it with a view that lots of people want to tell the story of how Lawrence of Arabia was made. No one wants to tell the story of how Turner and Hooch was made. So I approach it with that. It's very contemporary films and making of stories that I think a lot of the time you could comfortably say aren't the classics, but I still really like them. I have 2 print magazines. Film Stories is a monthly film magazine that's built on a bedrock of opportunity for people looking to write and get paid for their writing work for the first time, and also for filmmakers who are looking to get independent filmmakers looking to get coverage. It's really a magazine it's a mainstream magazine targeting it slightly towards the smaller rooms of the multiplex were they open. You can find that at www.filmstories.co.uk, and you can also find there the magazine I do for under 15s that's written by under 15s, which is Film Stories Junior.
And I was going to say, am I right in thinking that you can find both of those, or they can follow Film Stories on Twitter as well?
Oh yeah, at Film Stories Pod. It's the least catchy Twitter handle I could possibly get, so I had to
Wonderful.
have it.
You haven't heard ours yet. I would recommend it personally. I always one of your episodes is about the length of my tube ride from to Waterloo Station on my commutes, and it fits perfectly. So I forever associate your voice, and have been throughout today, Simon, with that tube ride, which is making me a little bit wistful in today's climate. But hopefully,
So me and dangerous public transport. Got it. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly the sentiment I was trying to express. Thanks.
Lovely.
Okay, we have been Fancy Animation. You can find us, of course, at fancy-animation.org or on Twitter, Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. That's also our Instagram handle and our Facebook page, so you can check us out there. We will be doing another feel-good fantasy animation next episode, so do get online and give us your suggestions. I will pull some more out of the hat and pick one for our next show. So we are still listening out there. We just took a little break today to talk about more fun 90s blockbusters. Simon, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure.
We'll be around next time. Chris, as always, take care. I'll see you then.
Bye.